One of the fascinations of my life has been the question, what makes movements move? Well, in this chapter, we begin to explore the infrastructure of movements, which are reproducing leaders, of reproducing churches, of reproducing networks. And within that, we find the answer to what makes a movement move.
I think if we're going to have the kind of traction and momentum that we saw in the early church when it comes to reproduction and reproduction of churches, reproduction of leaders, there really is a systems question that needs to be addressed, and it's one of infrastructure. I mean, if you take a look at a typical church, especially the kind of churches that we're building within New Thing, the infrastructure of a typical church really is based on small groups, or what we call community groups at our church reunion. It's so important to not just build a community that has a spiritual mission or presence, but that it actually is structured in such a way that it'll make the kind of impact that it's looking to have with its mission. So for example, when we started our third campus at Community Christian, when I was there, I had the opportunity to be the campus pastor there, and one of the biggest initiatives that we launched before launching the campus as a whole is we had to have so many community groups or small groups up and running. What were we going to use to care for people? What were we going to do to disciple people? What were we going to do to even build into and develop and coach leaders? And the infrastructure for that has always been community groups. I think you could say the same thing, or at least you need to address the same issues when it comes to a movement. Ultimately, what is the infrastructure for a movement? It really comes down to these networks that we're doing within New Thing. And so it's not just simply about planting a new church. You know, even planting a church once a year is a great thing, but one of the things that I was just remarking to even Dave about is we used to, at our times when we get together, talk specifically about how are we going to plant the next church. We don't tend to talk about that anymore. We know that if we have networks that are missionally focused on reproducing at every level, then one of the really healthy byproducts of just having a network is that churches are going to be planted. And so one of the things that we really strive to do is create an infrastructure within the New Thing network of smaller networks. And so that is continuing to move forward all the time. Specifically in our particular network, the one that I lead, there's a guy who is going to take the next network. It's going to birth very similar to the way that a community group would. So we have a guy on our team who's a pastor in New York for a church called Forefront, and he's going to make an excellent network leader, partly because he gets these principles of what it looks like to reproduce at all levels. In fact, their church is already meeting in 2 locations. They've become multi-site over the last year. So ultimately, I think the infrastructure of really a movement has to do with smaller networks.